Tom, is there any way to check with the people in Zoom land that,
We can hear you fine.
oh, wonderful. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for attending yet again one of these lengthy torture situations. I do want to start off today, though, with something a little bit different. We're all pretty much aware of what's been going on in the world with Ukraine and now with Israel. And we all have feelings about that, which I'm not here to explore, except that some of the context of what I'm going to talk about today ties in to what I will call some of the differences that you can see in the conflict in Ukraine and in Israel. But regardless of that situation, which I will come to in a moment, I want to just read something, and I thank Joe Card for this, it's an excerpt from a poem written by Longfellow, and it's called Killed at the Ford. And it relates to something in the Civil War, but I think this particular stanza represents something important for us all to keep in mind. It's very hard when we're sitting in a lecture to really put ourselves in the situations that people have faced on the battlefield. And this is one of those small little snippets that I think is important for us. Sudden and swift, a whistling ball came out of a wood, and the voice was still. Something I heard in the darkness fall, and for a moment my blood grew chill. I spake in a whisper, as he who speaks in a room where someone is lying dead. But he made no answer to what I said. Now, the story relates particularly to a young man who was riding along and was taken out by a sniper. What we need to remember especially when I throw out these huge numbers, is each one is a real person. Each one like ourselves, sitting here, or our own children or grandchildren, as the case may be, are the ones who were like this young man. Nothing glorious about what happened to him. He was riding along, now he's dead. We know that in all conflicts these happen, otherwise there wouldn't be any importance to our talking about them. But there's another element that comes into this, and that in part is how we judge what happened, the circumstances that led to it happening, and what were the motivations behind what's going on. In part, as I've talked about in all of the preceding lectures, there's an element in this particular conflict of World War II that takes us in very different directions compared to what I'll draw is a maybe somewhat arbitrary distinction between what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Israel. And the fundamental part of it I put up here. For those that I'll read it quickly, although I hate to read my slides. Dictatorship is rule based directly on force and unrestricted by any laws. So if we look at the conflict in Ukraine, we realize that atrocities have occurred. That's been out there in the news. There's nothing different about it. But the basic concept behind that conflict is not ideological. Whereas what we've seen happen in Israel truly is. And if you look at some of the information that Hamas has put out there, for example, in their covenant of 2017, where they talk about fundamental wish to establish a sovereign state with its capital in Jerusalem, you begin to deal with a very different fundamental from, for example, what's gone on in Ukraine. How does that relate to anything we're going to talk about today? In one sense, the war on the Eastern Front was both ideological and racist in nature. Some people may choose to not distinguish between those two. I do, because there are different elements involved. For example, in dealing with the Japanese in the Pacific War, in many ways that devolved into what I call a race war, without being pejorative about what it means. But in the Eastern Front, there was a clear distinction in both the mind of Hitler and in the mind of Stalin as to what this conflict was about. And that was basically on very different ideological principles, which meant your enemy had to be entirely and completely destroyed. Whereas if you go back to World War I, which was not an ideological war, although there were race elements tied into it, but they were not dominant the way they are on the Eastern Front. So when we think about the individual tragedy that I've tried to illuminate with this poem, and we look at the conflict in the Eastern Front, which is where we're going to start today, we begin to see great differences in how things developed, the kind of conflict that was engaged at a very personal level, and the ultimate aims that were established by the leadership on both sides. Oh, God. Sorry. All right, enough of this nonsense. Let me turn my phone off. I usually tell people to do that as well, and then here I am, leaving mine on. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to go back for a moment and just touch on the two major leaders who are involved, because ultimately in any conflict, it's the political goal which directs much of what the military is doing. In this situation, we're all familiar with Joseph Stalin. I'm not going to go into his history, except that he was a true blue communist and was willing to use the power of the state to control his population. And in terms of the fighting against the Germans, it was an important element of their ultimate triumph and what they were going to do when they constructed a peace if they should win. Similarly, this gentleman, I use that term in quotation marks, had a very different view of the world and what would happen if he was triumphant. It wasn't just a matter of extermination of the Jews, which was clearly one of his principal goals ultimately, but it was also the complete subjugation of Eastern Europe, and in particular the Slavs, to the German goal of taking over their land and basically making the Slavs slaves to support the German economy while German colonists began to take over the lands, and ultimately, expressed in his own words basically, to get rid of all of them, which meant their demise, not just their expulsion. I also bring this up because perhaps unfamiliar with a lot of you has been the issue of what happened with Armenia and Azerbaijan, and because the takeover of what's called Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh, now the 150,000 Armenians who were living there are basically gone. Now, part of that, their leaving is, in a sense, voluntary, but not voluntary in the sense that the behavior of Azerbaijan towards Armenians and what will happen in that territory is something that, again, brings up the issue of an ideological conflict. Fortunately, most of those people are getting out and won't be killed in the process. I put this man up now because he is a central figure in what we're going to come to in dealing with what's happening on the Eastern Front. This particular man, you may have run across his name or remember his name from previous lectures, was one of the central figures who actually changed the plan for the invasion of France. The initial plan had been a rehash, if you will, of what happened in World War I, and Manstein at the time felt that this was leading Germany down the same path they had followed in World War I. They were leading into the strength of the Allied forces. And through a number of different circumstances was able to convince Hitler, and then through him, the senior generals, to change their mode of attack. In the beginning of the Eastern Front conflict, he was in the north and was not yet a senior commander, at least as an army commander. That happened after the other elements that developed in the opening year or so of the Eastern Front. Now, I'm going to go through a quick rehash, very quick, of leading up to this particular point. Otherwise, what I'm talking about today will kind of be an island, and I want it to be part of the continent. Gotta remember to push the right button. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22nd, 1941, was the major attempt on the part of Germany, with almost exclusively German forces, some Romanians, to defeat Russia within 6 to 8 weeks, forcing the line to be driven back at least to Moscow, perhaps beyond, with an ultimate goal to establish a cordon which would isolate all of Eastern Europe under German control and keep the surviving Soviets, I use the word Russians interchangeably, from being able to use any strategic bombing to reach Germany. The idea here was just to create this large distance over which central Germany would be protected. But the primary function of this operation was to destroy the Russian armies at the frontier. And as I talked about in the other lectures, and I'll show you again here, that as the first 6 months evolved, so we go up to December 5, 41, the Germans had indeed gotten almost to Moscow. They were within, depending upon the source, 20 kilometers. We're talking about 12 miles from the Kremlin. They'd gotten that close before they were stopped. In that process, the Russians lost approximately 5 million. Now, that number hardly seems comprehensible, but we want to put it in this particular context, just so we understand how we personally, individually react to this kind of information. Currently, the total casualties thought to happen in Ukraine are roughly between 100,000 and 200,000 each side. It's a big number. And when you hear the media talk about it, it's as though these nations are on the verge of collapse because their populations have been decimated. This number, in 6 months, out of a Soviet population that was only somewhat bigger than current Russia's population, and I'm not going to get into the weeds of the demographics, 5 million. And they kept on fighting. And they would continue to fight through 4 years of war. that gives you an idea of how deeply modern societies can take a hurt and still continue to fight. This is something we tend not to appreciate or understand. Not only did they take those casualties and find themselves losing so much of their industrial base, both temporarily and permanently. Temporarily because they were vacating factories to the Far East, but permanently because a lot had to be left behind. Not only did they stop the Germans, but as soon as the Germans stopped, they launched a massive counterattack throughout almost the entire length of the Eastern Front. So at the end of just 6 months of battle, they had mustered enough resources to be able to launch a counteroffensive, which basically threw the Germans back and almost wrecked them in the process. So as we moved into 1942, there were a series of new challenges that each side faced. The Russians realized that the Germans would likely still have the capacity to launch an offensive. The question came up for them, where? Many German generals and Stalin and his leadership felt that the attack would come against Moscow. Moscow had been held out, and historians and a lot of the German generals who were writing after the war said, if only we'd taken Moscow. Now, I've been down that road in my previous lectures with you as to whether that would have ended the war or not. My own opinion is it would not. But importantly, Stalin had to decide how to allocate his resources. So he placed them in front of Moscow in order to prevent the Germans from reaching the city. The German generals thought, if we take Moscow, the war will end. But Hitler said, no, we're going to attack in the south. And this particular approach threw off the balance of the Russians in particular and allowed the Germans, as you'll see on this slide, to advance to Stalingrad and to advance down into the Caucasus. Now, they had reached, in effect, their high tide, if you will, and with the various counteroffensives that were launched in late 42, beginning in November, the Russians were able to encircle Stalingrad and launch several other limited offensives further north in order to try to, again, destroy the German army. The encirclement at Stalingrad, called Operation Uranus, was complemented by an expanded operation called, in the slide, Saturn, but it was drawn down a little bit, so the official title was called Little Saturn. And in the north, you'll see Operation Mars, where there was an attempt to encircle German units there. And I talked about that at some length in the last lecture. Operation Mars was a disaster for the Russians. Whereas in the south, around Stalingrad, that was an enormous achievement. And that takes us basically up to where we are now, because as the Germans surrendered in early February 1943, in Stalingrad, Russian forces were freed up to continue an offensive march against a very weakened German army. The losses Germany had sustained in 41 and early 42, up to about the point of their major offensive launching in May of 42, was that they had not in Germany enough people to replace their losses. So they brought in more Hungarians, the Italians, the Romanians. The Romanians and Hungarians hated each other, so they had to be kept separate. And that filled the numbers, but by combat efficiency and capacity, these allies were completely deficient in comparison to the German sources, and the Russians knew that. So in the next set of affairs, we now come to the basic issue of where do you go from here? If we look at it from the standpoint of the Russians, which is where we're going to start today, the idea is we have crushed a huge force of the German army in the south. Remember that when Stalingrad surrendered, this is now after 3 months of fighting. So you can think of all the casualties, dead, wounded, and so on that occurred in Stalingrad. There were 95,000 survivors. Of those 95,000, only 5,000 ever got home, which wasn't until the 1950s. So they're wiped out. Now think about what that means in terms of your structure. Now, that doesn't take into account all of the losses that took place once the Hungarians and the Italians and Romanians were struck. Indeed, what happened was that when the little Saturn was launched, and then the following events after that, the Hungarians lost nearly 150,000 prisoners. That's not dead and wounded. You have to add those in. And remember what I've said in this particular conflict, unlike what happens when Germany is fighting Britain and the United States, these prisoners basically never get home, ever. They're gone, not just from the roles of combat, but they are never going home. It's an important difference in the ideological conflict that's taking place with Germany and Russia, because when we captured people, or when the Germans captured British and Americans, generally they were kept in prison camps and they weren't summarily executed. Some were, but that was a relatively small part of what was going on. And then by comparison, think of the Pacific theater, in which few prisoners were captured on either side. And of those that were, what happened to them? How were they treated? Were the British and American, and I use British as the whole Commonwealth, treated differently by the Japanese than were treated by the Americans or British when the Japanese were captured? Again, an example of what it means to have a different kind of conflict in your mind. Okay. Just to conclude this particular part, and this map shows you the subsequent attacks that were going to take place during the immediate period after the collapse of Stalingrad, and the drive, particularly in the south, for the Russians to regain as much territory as possible. Now, again, to set the stage for you a little bit, down in the lower right corner, this is the area of the Caucasus, the areas where the oil fields are. This was a prime strategic goal for the Germans in 1942. They had gotten down there, but they were insufficiently equipped to be able to control the area sufficiently. And when Stalingrad was encircled, it put this entire Army Group A, at risk of being cut off from the rest of the Eastern Front. Their escape route, if they were caught there, would have only been across the Kerch Straits, which had very limited capacity, or they would have had to be evacuated by sea, except that the Russians still controlled much of the eastern coast of the Black Sea. So this would have been an enormously destructive affair. Literally, the Germans had to run for safety, and they had to cover several hundred miles in order to get out from the particular threat they were facing if the Russians were able to close the door at Rostov, which is down in the lower corner there, where you can see the Sea of Azov showing up. I don't have my pointer, but I think it's evident. In addition, never content, of course, the Germans were trying to find a way to buttress their line to keep themselves from being overrun entirely. And coincidentally, the Russians were still interested in offensive operations. Now, the amount of supplies and manpower that were required to conduct Operation Uranus and to Little Saturn and Operation Mars, it certainly consumed enormous amounts of material. But interestingly, again, with modern societies, they were still able to muster considerable support, manpower and material, to launch a couple other operations which they hoped would fundamentally destroy the German army. Similarly, now put yourself in the position of Hitler and saying, uh-oh, this is the second time the Russians have completely wrecked the German front. How am I going to react? Well, the first thing, of course, you got to get everybody out of the Caucasus as quickly as possible, or basically the war is going to end very quickly. But he also has this very convoluted front line, and he's got to shorten it up in order to free up enough manpower to be able to get reserves down south and stop the Russian advance at that point. As a result, there's this Operation Zethen, which is an evacuation of one of those big bulges that has occurred in the line, and you see it with the solid black line, for example. The blue icons you see in there are the German sources, the red are the Russians or Soviets. And you can see in particular where it is very, very narrow. So you'd think it would be an easy thing for the Russians to cut that off and completely surround those particular troops. They'd have no way out with all the resources used up to try to support Stalingrad with air transport. There's nothing here to support those guys. They would be lost forever. Fortunately for the Germans, they were able to escape and get out of here and keep that little waste from collapsing entirely. The second place they had was where Operation Mars had occurred in the northern portion, where Zhukov in particular had tried to crush another salient and had been defeated. But now, again, you've got to take all those blue units out and you've got to move them back to a line where you can set up a defense, hold the Russians from gaining any particular ground, and with the extra units you save, divert them to the south and buttress that line. Now think in terms of just the transport required. This is hundreds of miles of distance. It's not just a matter of saying, oh, I'm going to draw an arrow here and I'm going to do this and I'm drawing an arrow down there. I have to arrange for all of that material, not just the troops, to get down there, because troops alone aren't going to be able to stop them. They've got to have the weapons and the ammunition and the food and everything else that's necessary to keep it going. The enormous strain on the higher levels of leadership, both on the Soviet side and on the German side, is extraordinary. And the numbers involved are hard for us to comprehend. The reason I bring up the numbers is because when we move on to some of the campaigns in North Africa, the differences in numbers are extraordinary. And it's hard to sometimes judge that in comparison to what's happening on the Eastern Front. As I mentioned too, at this particular moment in time, which is now getting into 1943, you'll see that the German and Italian troops in North Africa are coming under great stress as they're being forced back from their furthest point of advance at El Alamein. And I'll cover that in a different section of the lecture series. What I want to have you appreciate at this point, however, is that the senior leadership that you're thinking about, or I want you thinking about, is for you as individuals to take a moment and ask yourself the following question. And let's let's make it very personal and say you're Adolf Hitler. All right. All right. Not a pleasant place to be, but you're in charge. And what you're witnessing is the collapse of your Eastern Front. And you're beginning to see the collapse of your advances in North Africa. And at this particular time, late 42, getting into 43, the Battle of the Atlantic is beginning to shift away from your favor. It's not what it was in 41 and 42. Remember, there was a part of 42 was called the Second Happy Time because the German submarines were out shooting Turkey. So now, what do? How are you going to respond to this? What resources do you have available? What are the diplomatic issues that now are in your face because Hungary has just lost a huge number of people. Romania has lost a huge number of people. These are your allies. How do you keep them in the fight? What kind of decisions are you forced to make? What are you going to do about North Africa? Because remember, in November of 42, the British and Americans invade North Africa. So now the whole southern border of the Mediterranean is at risk. And what does it mean if you lose that? So now you've got the Eastern Front collapsing, and now you might lose North Africa, which exposes your entire southern front of Europe. And Italy has taken a beating, and they're a weak reed anyway. How is this going to work? So it's hard for us when we're not called upon to make those decisions to understand this. And I'm not being sympathetic. He got himself into this mess. As far as I'm concerned, he deserves what happened. But that is a different issue from the approach I want us to be having. Now, once things have settled down more to the south, and the Germans begin to build up enough resistance with the troops that have gotten out of the Caucasus and been able to establish a defensive line, and the resources coming from the north have shifted down to help bolster those lines, there still are areas that are very weak. And the Russians, of course, are going to look for them. So they continue to launch these offensive moves, which are designed to beat back the Germans as completely as possible and regain as much territory as they can. Now, in doing that, one of the purposes of showing this slide is because it's not too dissimilar in its geography from where we see our current fighting in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. So some of the names you'll see here may resonate. Down at the very bottom, you'll see Kharkov, now called Kharkiv in Ukrainian. So it gives you a little idea of where things are happening on the greater scale. When this happens, the Russians, as I mentioned, have launched further offensives and basically destroyed the 2nd Hungarian Army and the 8th Italian Army. The Italians, I think, lost around 100,000 casualties. And this is in a short period of time. We're talking 3 months. 3 months. How many American casualties did we take through all of World War II? These numbers are staggering in terms of what they've done in comparison to what we lost with a much greater population. So it's important, again, to keep this in somewhat of a context. As the advances occur, Operation Gallop, as it's called, takes place just south of Kharkov. The other slide that I was showing you is further to the north, as I'll go back and show you. Kharkiv is down at the very bottom central portion. You can just barely make out the name there. And in this particular case, the Russians are trying to drive as far west as they can and recapture Kharkiv, both for morale purposes, but also as a transportation hub. Further south, get there. Further south, what's called Operation Gallop, again, occurring over just a period of 2 months. The Russians make enormous strides in beginning to encircle the areas that are important. Kharkiv is just off the map to the north, just off the map. And they're driving towards the Dnieper River, which you'll see in the far left of this slide, and the town called Dnipropetrovsk. This is a huge supply area of critical importance to the Germans in order to have the sufficient resources to resist the oncoming Russian onslaught. Where you see Holt down below, he's part of the group that managed to escape out of the Caucasus and establish a defensive line across the river, which runs north-south shortly to the west of Rostov, which is at that apex point where the Sea of Azov ends. And he's able to help stabilize the line there temporarily. Manstein is brought down to run what was initially called Army Group Don, because they were on the Don River, only they're not there anymore, so they get renamed. And these names sometimes will throw us all off when we're reading, but it's Army Group South at this point. Now, the danger that is being faced by Manstein in particular, that's why I showed his portrait earlier, is he's now in charge of securing this area. And what kind of resources does he feel he has? And how is he going to react to this great additional offensive that is now encompassing Kharkov, further to his north, as I said, just off the map? So what happens at this point? The fighting is enormously intense. And I show this picture because nowadays, we tend to, for example, think back on, 1991 Gulf War, all right, just to put this in context for you. We have the Abrams tank that is part of the armored force units, weapons that are used to defeat the Iraqi army. And they do this within an extraordinary short period of time. And it turns out that practically no Abrams tank was lost due to enemy combat, but mostly due either to breakdowns, got stuck somewhere. There's one story where one of the Abrams, they could not seem to get out, so they brought another Abrams up to shoot into its flank, which would be one of the areas where you're most vulnerable. And they fire a round into this Abrams tank, and it looks like it blows up. And they think, okay, that's done. And then somebody goes over to the thing and starts up the engine. So we tend to think of this level of invulnerability. Well, that's disappearing in the Ukraine war right now. All right. And there's lots of videos that you can see about how these so-called modern tanks are being wrecked. This is an example from World War II, but you could translate that into modern day. And the destructive power of anti-tank ammunition is amazing and scary. So I show this.
Is that a Tiger?
No, that is a Mark IV.
Okay.
The Tigers did not show up here until a bit later. They're being brought down from the Leningrad area, but they're not going to have any primary function until you come to Kursk, which is in the summer. And the Panther tank wasn't yet on the field, though it was coming. And as a short aside, it's one of the reasons Hitler delayed launching Operation Citadel instead of May. He wanted to wait until early July. He wanted to get those Panther tanks available. The Mark IVs, which had existed from the very beginning, was normally armed with a short barrel 75. So it didn't have any real armor penetration capability. But when the Germans ran into the T-34 and said, uh-oh, we can't defeat these things nose on nose. So they began to upgun them. And eventually they could put a high velocity 76 or 75 in there. I forgot, I think it was a 76.
At this stage, do they have shaped charges?
Yes.
Or depleted
No depleted
Okay.
uranium, that didn't exist.
Okay.
But they used tungsten as one of the great metal things, and they had penetrating rods they called sabot rods and things of this sort. So the ammunition was evolving enormously. And later in the war, with even these small handheld weapons like the Panzerfaust that had shaped charges. Now, they only had a 50-yard distance that you could shoot, but once it hit, it had a configuration that penetrated almost any armor. So they were amazingly developing. This is, of course, one of the things that happens in wartime. Very, very quickly, you learn what to do to protect yourself from getting killed or find ways to kill the enemy. Now, Operation Star is another example of this continued offensive that's going on by the Russians. They are pushing everything forward as fast as they can to gain as much ground as they can to try to keep the German army off balance. But one of the great deficiencies that still exists in the Russian army at this time is they lack some of the logistical support, which allows them not just to continue an offensive, but to not find themselves so weakened at the end that they basically can't even defend what they've now taken. It's a little bit like, I can run from here to the door, I can walk to the next door, but I got to crawl to the next door. And when I crawl to the next door, if you're standing there with a sledgehammer, I can't help myself. So in terms of the context of what we're dealing with right now, you can see that the Russians have gained an enormous amount of territory. They've driven back important German units, and they have surrounded Kharkov. And indeed, they're going to take it. I show this slide because this shows that in terms of the conflict that we're seeing on the Eastern Front, there's a very different element than what you will see when you begin to look at what we'll call the Western Front, where the Americans and the British particularly are engaged. And that is that there are no armored personnel carriers here. All right. So how do you get the troops to keep up with advancing armor? Stick them on the back of a tank, have them drive forward, and when they get close to the areas of engagement, they're extremely vulnerable. Get them off the tanks and have them advance with the armor, because armor advancing alone is actually surprisingly vulnerable to infantry. So you need the combination of forces. They recognized that, but they didn't have the vehicles to keep up. So they would do this. Now, if you were a machine gunner in a nice little foxhole somewhere and you saw these guys coming on the back of a tank, they're all ripe targets. So this is a matter of how you adjust to a situation where you want from the Russian side to advance as fast and as far as possible, but you've got to have infantry with you, and they just can't walk fast enough. And you don't have the trucks, and you don't have infantry transport vehicles in any significant numbers. Remember, there's still a lot of horses out there too. Something we tend to forget because we show pictures of mechanization rather than the pictures of the logistical support. What the Russians also did at this particular time is they had learned some very, very important lessons from the Germans. And that was the value of close air support. Now, a reason I show this is because in 1941, when Operation Barbarossa was launched, the Russian Air Force was basically destroyed. Decimated is an absolutely wrong term. That usually means 1 out of 10. If anything, it was 90% destroyed. And many of their aircraft that were back in the further lines, beyond where the Germans could destroy them, were of what we call secondary models. So even if pilots survived, and a good number were lost, even if you had a pilot survive, you're putting them into an inferior aircraft. So when you go up against your opponent if your tactics and training are not superb, you're going to die. Now, at this particular point, though, the Russians began to realize the importance of having armor to protect their pilots, and they also began to understand the value of close air support. So the Russians, the Soviets, are really learning the art of war. It's being taught to them very, very painfully, but they are learning. And this becomes a critical element. Now, the Sturmovik has sometimes been called the best fighter bomber of the war. There's some controversy about all of that. And those of us who are more Western oriented would say, no, we've got the better fighter bombers and so on. But the point I'm trying to make is that within just 18 to 24 months, the Russians had already achieved an extraordinary amount of improvement in how they were going to conduct fighting. But they still had lessons to learn, and they were going to learn them painfully as we come to this particular segment. At this particular time, Kharkiv was nearly surrounded, as I showed you on an earlier slide. And the loss of Kharkiv was about to create a morale problem for both sides, but more for the Germans, a logistical hub that was going to be lost, where they needed the road network and the railroad network in order to move things, troops and material very quickly. But with the losses that they had been experiencing through all of this fighting that had gone on that I described earlier, it turns out that Hitler still was ambivalent about giving up territory. Now, again, as an aside, you may recall from the previous lectures, those of you who were here before, when the Russians launched their counteroffensive in December of 1941, the German army was caught well off balance and was being thrown back everywhere. And it looked like it was an utter catastrophe. Hitler said, no retreat, stand in place, occupy the villages, occupy the road junctions, stay where you are. And of course, many of his generals said, that's a death sentence. But in retrospect, more modern historians looked at and said he saved the German army because it caused the advancing Russian forces to be broken up and not have the network that they needed in order to keep the offensive supplied and moving forward. This lesson that Hitler allegedly learned in opposition to his generals, and with the success that had occurred in launching the attack in the south in 1942, when they penetrated to Stalingrad and down into the Caucasus, again, against the considered advice of his generals, said, these guys are idiots. They don't understand warfare. They don't know how to perform when you're dealing with the kinds of things I'm dealing with. Unfortunately, it can also lead to your own entrapment, your own hubris. So the failure to retreat out of Stalingrad and get the Sixth Army out was due to Hitler saying, stay where you are. Similarly, he's telling Lance, who is the general in charge of defending Kharkiv, stay there. Make it a fortress, make the Russians fight for it. After all, look at what we did damaging the Russians in Stalingrad, even though we lost the Sixth Army. But stay there and make the Russians fight you, and that'll suck up their units and they won't have the power to continue to drive forward and so on. And Lance is having none of it at this point. Now, remember, if you challenge Hitler to this degree, and you say, I'm not going to obey the orders. Remember, Hitler has a much greater view of what's going on than does this guy, right? Hitler has really the possibility of saying, you're not only relieved of command, I'm going to shoot you. So you are literally putting your life on the line by doing this. Hitler didn't want to give up the city, and eventually he accepts that the city is to be evacuated, but he just simply replaces Lance. He kicks him out, he puts a new guy in charge, and that guy says, I'm out of here. We're leaving. So he says, okay, fine. All right, off you go. Now we come to the most critical set of decisions that are being made at this particular time on the Eastern Front. And we'll talk about this for the next few minutes, then we'll take a break. All right. In this situation now, the southern part, the southern half of the entire Eastern Front is collapsing. You've been able to get out of the Caucasus, but you obviously had to leave a lot of stuff behind to do it because you're running hell-bent for leather to prevent being trapped. A bunch of units are kept in what's called the Kuban Peninsula, which is to protect the Straits of Kerch, which lead into Crimea. Why is that important? Because the Crimea needs to be held by the Germans to prevent the Russians from putting bombers there, which can strike the oil fields in Romania, Ploesti, and destroy the ability of the German Wehrmacht to have fuel. So you've got to hold on to the Crimea. So you put this defensive work in the Kuban to protect so that Russians can't cross the straits. But the Russians to the north of the Sea of Azov are beginning to advance towards the Crimea. Sure, you may not be able to get across the Straits of Kerch, but if you can get to the Perekop Isthmus, which is that little neck of land that leads from the main section of Ukraine down into Crimea, the whole 11th Army and all those units which are in the Kuban are caught. They're done. They might be able to evacuate by sea, but it's going to be very, very difficult. So now the front is collapsing. You've got Manstein down there, and Hitler flies over to meet with him and talk about what they're going to do next. Now, some historians felt that Hitler was coming to relieve Manstein because Manstein had been in charge of trying to relieve Stalingrad and had been unsuccessful doing it. And he's beginning to wonder if this guy really is up to the challenge. Now, put yourself, in a sense, in a conference room. And think about the situation that you're bringing in as Hitler, where you have enormous distrust of the judgment of any of your generals, because time and time again, you've bested their judgment with your own. And you're in a place where you are the most senior person who has to look at the entire global situation. And here you're dealing with a guy who so far had performed well, but now was failing you. Manstein says, let the Russians advance to the point where they basically have no logistical support, and I will launch a counterattack. And you're thinking to yourself, you serious? After the beating you've taken, the retreats you've had to initiate, the disaster that has unfolded around Kharkov to your north, putting a huge dent in the line, I'm supposed to listen to you? Put yourself in that situation. And what kind of appreciation does Manstein have that even allows him to think that he could launch a counteroffensive against the Russian advance and be successful? How does he understand the nature of all of these units that have been taking a battering for the last several months? And he's going to turn them around and they're going to launch a successful counteroffensive. You can begin to appreciate how difficult this situation is for the Germans. Yes.
Yeah, the idea is good, but how does Manstein know when the Russians are extended?
Right.
I could see he knows his own troops, say, and they'll rise to the occasion. But when is that moment right? How do you know that?
And the interesting part is I haven't found a single historian who has dealt with that particular question. But that is the fundamental question. This is one of the problems in reading history, and why in this particular kind of environment that we have here today with our lectures, I'd like you to ponder those things because it's hard to find the answer. Now, I can give you a presumption, and it's the best I can do. First is that the Russians lacked trucks. So their logistical support was obviously weak, even though we, that is the United States, literally had been sending thousands of trucks to Russia every month, trying to bolster their logistic support. The second part is that he would get reports as to what the units were confronting. That is, 2 weeks ago, it was 100 Russian tanks. Now there are 50. Okay, they're beginning to run out of logistical support because those that are damaged or broken down can't be repaired and brought to the front line. So they're beginning to run out that way. What about presumption of casualties? Well, they've taken this many casualties, inflated numbers all the time, as you know. But these are the kinds of things that a senior general has to take and integrate, and then he has to say, just as you did, when is the right time? And it emphasizes to all of us, and I really find this fascinating to do when you are literally saying, okay, how would I know what to do? When is the right time? How do I organize all of these units and my senior subordinates to get them on board with this plan and execute it? Because if we fail, we're going to be in a world of hurt, right? Because we'll have expended all of that energy, all of those material, all those men to accomplish what? Maybe not much of anything. And we may be in a weakened state even further. Yes.
To put it simply, this is rope-a-dope.
Yes, that's an excellent analogy.
Yeah.
An excellent analogy. What this map shows is, and this is deliberate. If you look at this map, you're going to say, this looks very confusing. Absolutely, it is confusing. And yet the directions, particularly where you can see some of the arrows that start around this, just north of where it says Manstein, and you see some of those arrows moving in. All of that has to be organized. The orders have to get down to the lowest level, and it all has to be organized so that it's tactically efficient and operationally efficient. The resources have to be there, the manpower have to be there, they have to have the food, the ammunition, and the fuel. It all has to be there. So when you look at this and notice the time frame, this is February. Now, this is not the sunny Caribbean. Okay. The road network is very limited, and remember, there are very few paved roads in the Soviet Union, which means that if it's raining or it's thaw time, there's been snow, now it's melting, all of that turns into gum. And yet you're saying you have to advance this far under these circumstances and accomplish these goals. This is called the famous backhand blow. And I like the term because it basically means you've hit me this way, but now I hit you that way. But a backhand blow doesn't sound very forceful either. You know, I think a right hook might be a better term, but whatever. The important element, though, is that Manstein is successful. And as you can see here, that shows you the overall advances that are taking place and the amount of disruption in the Eastern Front on the south. And it looks as though everything is going to collapse. Where you see the blue line and the black line, and you see where Kharkov is above, it looks as though the initial point is to destroy the vanguard of the Russian forces, which represent the greatest threat. Remember, I mentioned the importance of Dnipropetrovsk as a huge supply line. And there's another reason why the Dnieper is important. It's not just a river. Have any of you been to Budapest?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, you have. You know, on the Buddhist side, it's mountain.
Yes.
On the Pest side, it's flat. Well, that's true along much of the Dnieper. So if the Russians get across the Dnieper and they can occupy that high ground, you've lost one of your critical defensive lines. Whereas if you can hold that line, then you can see further to the east and see how their forces are gathering and where their main points of attack will be and so on. So it was very important to cut that off at the beginning. Now, Manstein's ultimately successful in stopping the Russian onslaught with this backhand blow. And I'll show you another set of slides and then we'll conclude this section. But the importance here also is to recognize, as I tried at the very beginning, to look at the human cost. And there's an old phrase that when elephants fight, the grass is trampled. And this is an example of that with just a couple of pictures. The second blow, as you see, even more convoluted and more striking in terms of its complexity, is to drive off and kill as many Russians as possible in the course of this set of attacks. Manstein, with the second iteration of his attack, is able to regain Kharkov. The Russians decide they're not going to try to hold on to the city very much. They're going to withdraw. And when they do, that leaves the Germans in control of a large segment of territory they had just lost. So they've regained that. And in the context of that, what you see here in this slide is how eventually the Russians are thrown back across the Donets River, but up further to the north, which is not evident on this slide, there still was considerable distance over which the Russians had advanced. And in doing that, they had created a salient in the line. Now, as you look at this, I have the large brown arrow pointing to the town of Kursk, which actually turns out to be the middle of this particular salient. If you look down to the lower left from the point of the arrow, you'll see where Kharkov is. And you'll see that there, the red arrows are turned back. They're thrown back, and you now have a new line that is centered along this entire front with a bulge around the area of Kursk. And this is going to be of great importance later on. As the Germans are forced into a dire retreat, they have less and less compassion for anybody who challenges them. Particularly, partisan warfare had begun to escalate. Now, there's a whole lot of legal issues that surround what partisan warfare is, rules of law, or I'm sorry, laws of war and things of that nature. But basically, the Russians from the very beginning of this conflict had wanted to get rid of Jews and commissars and execute them on the spot. Or in the case of many Jews, particularly in Poland and Ukraine and so on, to ship them to Germany as forced labor and then to death camps. This kind of behavior was one of the things that undermined the ability of the Germans to maintain a rear that was relatively calm. And as a result, they would take harsh actions against anyone, any village, any location where they felt partisan warfare was jeopardizing their rear areas. And as a result of this, the tragedies, the human tragedies that unfold are only really visible to us in an occasional photograph. Whereas when I tell you something like this with the Manstein's backhand blow, the Russians lost estimated 52 divisions and brigades, including 25 tank brigades, gone from the roster. Estimated 300,000 Russian casualties just over the fighting around Kharkov. So it gives us a perspective that we need to keep in mind in dealing with this. In ideological war, kill them all. Let God sort them out. Right? Remember that phrase. Okay, let's take a break. You all been extraordinarily patient.
Michael,
Answer any
question.
questions.
Now, this execution of partisans occurred as Manstein was retreating.
It occurred actually throughout the entire Eastern Front, almost from the beginning. Almost from the
Second piece is, yet Manstein survived the Nuremberg trials. He lived in 1973.
Yeah.
So I would have assumed he would have been right after Goebbels and
Yeah, that's one of the great controversies has had, as I said, all of the German senior commanders, all of them had been informed of the directive to execute commissars once they were found. Didn't matter. You're a commissar, just go shoot them. We're not even going to bother to arrest you. We're not going to bother to send you a camp. You're going to be shot. That happened at the very beginning, and it continued throughout. In terms of the laws that protected Manstein, I think he was in prison for a while and then let out. Unlike the others, he was not considered as egregious as some of the others were.
because Yodel was executed.
Yes, because of his particular high senior position. Right. And Goering would have been executed if he hadn't gotten a cyanide capsule and managed to kill himself. And, you know, Hitler had shot himself. So Goebbels had, you know, killed himself and his family. Yeah, it's really awful. And one of the fundamental parts of this, which you actually indirectly just highlighted, was that in the treatment of the Germans who were captured, they had a trial. In other words, we did not approach that as an ideological situation where they have to be exterminated. We still adhered to the rules of law. We did the same thing with the Japanese. We didn't just take them out into a courtyard and shoot them. When you turned over certain people to the Russians, even Russian prisoners of war, it was not uncommon for them to be killed or sent to Siberian labor camps and never return home. So that's part of the difference between an approach that we have in the West than you'll see in many other places. And it's highlighted right to this day when you look at what's happened in Israel. Despite what we, you know, rightfully understand as a humanitarian crisis in Gaza because of all those so-called Palestinian civilians, remember the following. Hitler was elected to office.
No.
Yes, he became chancellor in an election. And then he took over, but again, you could argue that it was illegitimate, but the point was he was well supported in his position. Hamas was the government of Palestine. Hamas isn't an independent terrorist organization. It was elected by the people of Gaza along with Fatah. And Hamas got Fatah kicked out and it basically expelled to the West Bank. And they have run that place ever since. So when they attacked Israel, it was a government, not just a terrorist organization, that was attacking. And that is why Israel could declare war, because it's a government that attacked you. Now, you could argue that their election was illegitimate. They got 90% of the vote. So in terms of that, you have a different dynamic. But if you look at how the Israelis are treating Gaza, just think of what we did to German and Japanese cities. Did we try to distinguish who was a non-combatant from a combatant? Hell no, we firebombed all of Japan, and we bombed and firebombed, especially a place like Dresden, where you can read a story about that, and inflict 60, 70,000 casualties or dead in those places. And nobody put us on trial.
We
won.
The victors
Yeah.
don't get tried.
That's right.
Well, yes and no. I mean, remember Me Live.
Eh,
No, I know.
Lieutenant, a second lieutenant, come
I'm
on, give me
trying
a
to,
break.
what
You
I'm
gotta
trying to
also
do is
remember
just
that
point out
The
that
Germans actually had Wehrmacht, officers, Manstein, and then they had a whole political party behind them.
Yeah.
And those were the guys that were giving the orders to kill.
Yeah.
It wasn't Manstein.
not directly,
No.
but because he had received the orders, in effect, he was kind of caught. And then the Einsatztruppen, I think Einsatztruppen, were associated with every army group. And although they operated technically independently, they still were within that jurisdiction.
Most Wehrmacht generals did not like
Oh, no.
this backup plan,
Right,
who were actually in charge of most of their men.
yeah,
And that's one of the reasons they weren't, not everybody was executed, because they were trying to do what they were, Manstein was to win a war, not to eliminate people. It was the political side of it
yeah.
that was gonna eliminate, that's what Hitler wanted.
And this is the idea of what I've talked about in terms of the ideological erase war compared to a more standard type of conventional war.
Yep.
That's when you look at the differences in Ukraine and you look at the differences in Israel. You say, how are those alike? How are they different? And again, I'm getting very personal about this. McConnell said the two are inextricably linked. Well, it may be the highest 100,000 feet level, there's a link, but it is a very tenuous one. Whereas the nature of the conflicts are distinctly different and have very different political goals involved. In the conflict in Ukraine, it is primarily over territory, not over destroying the Ukrainians or destroying all the Russians. What's happened in Israel is about destroying the Jews. Unequivocally, the information is right there in their own words. Their own words. That's what they want.
And Iran helps.
And Iran helps.
Yeah, you're talking about responsibility. Well, I think when you lectured on Hitler coming to power, I did a little research. And at that time, Angela Merkel was still the Chancellor of West Germany. And when Hitler became Chancellor, his party, the NASDAQ or Nazis, had a smaller vote than Merkel's. He was put in power by a coalition, as was Angela Merkel. And so there was a coalition primarily of the Prussian aristocracy and stuff who were terrified of the communists. Anybody that was against the communists was okay with us. So they were just as responsible as the Nazis were putting Hitler in power. They didn't recognize him, turning on them and destroying them, but that was a later thing, so, this- after these things take over, it's almost like it is happening with the House Republican. Which faction in the coalition is going to, destroy the other factions of the coalition and come out on top.
Yeah, but you've
I
got to
have maps
completely
here.
destroy the other faction because 5 people can mess things up.
No, wait a minute, before you degenerate into a political battle, please. There's some books and maps that you might want to take just a moment to look at. As I mentioned, the maps that I have all the drawings on just allow you to see the more scope of what's going on that I can present in a single slide, only because the slides seem to be relatively small in comparison to what you're seeing. The second part is that Greg brought over some books as well, which are wonderful histories if you ever want to delve into this more deeply. Particularly the 2-volume series that he has listed there, and I use certainly as one of my research points. The book I put on front here on the Eastern Front is largely a set of photographs, and it's worth flipping through just to get an idea of what's going on. It's very difficult to comprehend the scope of affairs here. It truly is, but it is so fundamentally important to the outcome of World War II that rightfully, in my view, at least, it is fair for the Soviets/Russians to maintain that it was their work, their fighting, their sacrifices, which were the critical point in the defeat of Germany. The scope of losses is extraordinary. And there's no way I could see us being able to get into Europe and freeing Europe if it hadn't been for the Russians.
Were these troop movements back and forth? Were they on trains or were they just walking or?
Largely trains, which was one of the critical elements that had to be supported. And that's why partisan activity was so dangerous, because they would blow up bridges. Now, if you have a train and you've lost a bridge, that's different from just blowing up a track, because you got to get the weight to be carried there. But trains were absolutely key. And then think just in terms, and Joe knows a great deal about this from the Civil War, the idea of monitoring and adjusting train activity, because the rail network was very deficient in Russia. And it also had to do with the width of the track. The Russian width was greater than the German. So you couldn't take a German rail car from Germany and run it all the way up to Kharkiv. You had to either rebuild the track to meet the German requirements, or you had to find Russian train equipment and use that. And then you had to offload and then reload. So all of this was stuff that the German generals in particular had to learn and adjust. So all these troop movements, enormously complicated. It's hard to fathom. I mean, it really is.
In such a broad area, I mean.
Yeah. And one of the things that we disparage often, even in the histories, is, again, I'm thinking of General Grant, all right, just as an example. They show him sitting under a tree, looking at a map, smoking a cigar with some staff around. And you think, okay, so what's the big deal? What's going on in this guy's head? What does he really have to do to get this to work? And an example that is worth considering is to take the entirety of Broome County, all right, get rid of 75% of the road network, and say you're going to take every single person in Broome County and you're going to move them to Albany. How are you gonna get them there? And it's a little fun exercise, actually, to think, well, let's see now, I need a truck. Because they can't walk that far. I gotta get them there in a week, right? A week seems like a long time because you can drive to Albany in just a couple hours.
Oh, the Civil War, one of the best examples of moving troops, the 11th and 12th Corps.
Yes,
And they were moved very quickly.
very fast by train.
And in fact, when it started, Lincoln was one of the ones that said, yeah, you can do it. I know you can do it. But the rest of the people were saying, no, that can't be done.
Right.
It was not.
So in terms of that, you think, well, okay, now let's really get into the nitty gritty. And that is that I can put 20 people in a truck. Okay, okay. I need fuel for the truck. I need food and water for them. They're gonna bring their weapons, so I need their ammunition, right? I have to have a driver who's capable, maybe a second driver. Then I have to have the unit organized so that the 20 guys get on aren't from 5 different units. They're all from the same unit. But I need 500 trucks. Okay, so where am I gonna get 500 trucks? And how am I gonna get fuel? And then how am I gonna organize who gets onto which truck? And not only that, but when they get there, do they all stop in the same place? Heck, no, I got 500 trucks. I mean, that's a line that's 3, 4, 5 miles long. And if I'm gonna do this, and the Russians have air superiority, think of the one aircraft coming down a road and blows up the first 2 trucks. So you have all of this enormous complexity going on.
We're so complicated. Why do we do it?
Well, as
It's not
Robert Lee said, it's good that war is so tragic in a sense, because we love it too much. Yeah, it's one of the hard parts. Absolutely. Okay, people, you guys have been extraordinarily patient. I will want to conclude this at 2 o'clock. No problem. Thanks, sweetheart. I'm watching the clock. We're going to finish at 3 o'clock. Right. All right. And again, my apologies. I get talking about things and then it's hard for me to stop.
That's why we come.
Well, you're more than generous, Robert, I tell you that. But I appreciate that. I'm going to shift gears because what I want to emphasize right now is to keep in mind what we have been talking about and how the Eastern Front has now solidified towards the end of March, right? Because Manstein's attack occurs in February, but it extends into March. Now there's going to be a hiatus on the Eastern Front for a period of time, and things will not stop. That is, there'll still be fighting going on. Estimates of 1,000 casualties a day are not unusual to either side during a quiet period, right? But fundamentally, what's happened on the Eastern Front is that the line has solidified with a bulge that occurs around the city of Kursk that I mentioned. And now, from the Eastern Front perspective, there's a hiatus that occurs for a couple of months while each side sort of gathers its strength back together and figures out what's going to happen next. I'm not going into that right now because I want to jump to what's happened elsewhere that has a profound influence on what's going on in the European side of this conflict. And that's what's happening in North Africa. Again, I'm going to do a quick recap of some of the events that have occurred. I'll make this a lot quicker than I did for the Eastern Front. In this situation, the map that you're seeing right now shows you basically the western portion. Now, off to the right, where you see Libya, you've got hundreds of miles before you get to Egypt, which is where critical events are going to take place very quickly. But what I want to point out is that at this particular point of the war, that is early into 42, we're not towards late 42 just yet in this particular context, is decisions are being made about how best to use the American army, which is now growing in strength. Remember that there was a decision made almost at the very beginning. In fact, even before we entered the war, that when we entered the war, Germany would be our primary target. Even though Japan struck us and was the first nation, Imperial Japan, against which we declared war, it wasn't until a couple of days later when Hitler declared war on the United States that we ended up reciprocating and say, okay, you want to fight, we'll fight. The decision between Churchill and Roosevelt was to focus our attention primarily against Germany. Now we ask ourselves, what can the American army do? Well, we're untrained. We're bringing in lots and lots of conscripts. What's the best use for those guys? If most of them are going to be directed towards Germany, that means they have to go to England, or they have to train on the East Coast of the United States, so eventually they can get shipped across the Atlantic. This is why this particular map showing the western portion is critical, because decisions are being made at the highest level as to where to best use the American army. And there's great controversy between the British and the Americans about what's to happen. The Americans being very, we use the word laser focused, it's a little bit of a distortion, but focused on getting onto the continent of Europe. And the British saying, you guys are crazy. First, you don't have any training worth anything and you have no combat experience. You think you're going to invade the continent of Europe? Give me a break. You guys need some combat experience at the very least, right? So you also need time to build up the resources, because once you're on the continent of Europe, your intention is to stay there, not be kicked back out. So they eventually agree that it's going to be a focus in North Africa. This shows you a little broader part of the eastern portion off the map from what I showed you before. And it also gives you a little bit of an idea of the terrain that we're looking at. Again, looking at maps, everything is two-dimensional. But wars are fought in 3 dimensions. And that means the terrain is a critical part of what is going to happen. It's going to be a critical part of where you even choose to fight. So these particular choices are not just driven by some historical imperative that says this is where you're going to fight. These are choices made by the commanders and by their political leadership in particular. All right. As I had talked about in previous lectures, the Italians initially in 1940s thought they could invade Egypt, and they, although they severely outnumbered the British, were destroyed. Their army was basically cut off and wrecked, almost back to, and I'll go back to this little town that you see on the far left called and I'm afraid my pronunciations are bad, but I've always pronounced it El Agilia. Maybe I need to be more phlegm related. Agilia, I don't know. Anyway, the British had already gotten about all that distance until Rommel was sent to North Africa, developed something we've heard of as the Africa Corps, and then assaulted the British at that time, who had been taking units and sending them to other locations of conflict, particularly in the Middle East and towards the Far East. So the British were weakened, Rommel attacks, he drives all the way up to the Tobruk, which is in the center on that you'll see on the map, and he surrounds the town of Tobruk, and he drives the British back off past Salum and Halfaya, that you can see where the line tends to dip a little bit south under the letter M. There he is stopped. The British eventually are successful in counterattacking, relieving Tobruk, and they drive Rommel all the way back to El Agheila. Rommel says, "Oh, that didn't work. Give me more resources, though, and I can attack, and I bet I can beat the British again." Now, we have to keep in context the time frame here. January to April, 42. What had happened in December of 41 into February of 42? The Russian counteroffensive outside of Moscow. The Germans have taken a pounding, and it's a close run thing as to how much of the German army will survive. So Rommel saying to Hitler, "Give me more resources." He's saying, "You gotta be kidding me. I gotta bolster the Eastern Front. I don't have the stuff." Now, if you want to launch a limited offensive and try to keep the British off guard, well, that's fine and dandy, but I don't have the stuff to send you. I haven't got it. Well, Rommel being Rommel attacks. And when he does, he is remarkably successful in getting forward, as I show here, to Tobruk, and then he's driven back. And now he's saying to himself, okay, that didn't work. What am I going to do now? So he's going to start another offensive. And when he launches this offensive, he is going to drive with remarkable success all the way across North Africa from where he starts, all the way to the borders of Egypt. But en route, while he's doing that, he is able to take, I'm going to go back here, even though it's not shown on this map, he's able to take Tobruk. Don't worry about the time frame here. This is a little bit later. So when he takes Tobruk, he now has a location where he can have supplies shipped across the Mediterranean. And that can be closer to his ultimate needs, where his front line is, than if he had to wait all the way come from Tunis, which was another 1,000 miles away. He's able to drive forward not only to cross the border in Egypt, but he's actually able to drive to a very particular location of critical importance. And that is, you'll see on this map, Mediterranean Sea in the upper right, and this thing called the Qatar Depression down in the south. The Mediterranean Sea, clearly nobody's walking across that unless we're not going there. Don't mean to make puns. The Qatar Depression is basically a sea of sand. It is essentially impassable to motor vehicles. So no significant activity can occur by going south through the Qatar Depression. You might send a little raiding party off over there, but basically no significant force with any significant combat power can go there. You'll also notice that there are a few ridges. For us, these ridges may seem as though, oh, they're hundreds of feet tall or even further. You know, oftentimes these are very slight areas of elevation that allow you to see out a good distance because the land is basically very flat. So these ridges become particularly important because in this particular context, your line of sight is markedly improved. Now, why does that help you? It helps you figure out what the enemy is doing. You can see him at a much further distance than you would if you were in woodlands or mountain ranges and things of that sort. But secondly, it has an enormous effect on your gunnery, on your firepower, particularly for direct fire weapons. Now, without getting too much in the weeds, what I want you to think about is the following. Most engagements that took place in Vietnam were within 100 yards. Go to a football game, look down and say, man, that's pretty darn close. Take your unfavorite friend and put him down at the end and pretend you want to shoot him, okay? Not a bad target, okay? He's out there, but doable, especially if I've got a decent weapon, right? But some of these engagements are taking place at 1,000 yards or further. So if you walk somebody out 1,000 yards, you'd be lucky to find them. But many of your direct fire weapons, either on your tanks or on your anti-tank guns, for example, can reach out and touch someone at that range. And your artillery can reach out miles. So even though indirect fire by artillery is still a critical factor, and if you're an artillery piece and you can see out 4 or 5 miles with your binoculars and see that there's oncoming enemy, that gives you a lot of time to shoot at them before they get close enough to hurt you, right? Ridges are important because even an elevation of 20 or 30 or 40 feet may allow you to hide behind that ridge where you can't be seen, or dug in on what's called the military crest, where you can see what the enemy is doing, but you're not exposed. And he can't see who's there. So these little pieces become very, very important. When Rommel drove into this area, he launched an attack that was beaten off, and he had to retreat a bit and regather his forces. And because of particular political conditions that existed within the British Empire at that time, Churchill, who tended to get in the way, he had some great ideas, but he also had some absolutely horrible ideas, decided that his senior commander there, Auchinleck, was not the guy for the job. So he flew over to Cairo with his chief of staff, Sir Alan Brooke, and he said, we need a new commander. Who should it be? They said, well, let's get Alexander. He seems to be very capable. He's suitable for this kind of conflict. Let's bring him over. But we also need to have someone, because at this particular time, Auchinleck had taken charge not just of the theater, but he had taken charge of the 8th Army. In other words, the organization that was actually fighting in Egypt, as opposed to his other concerns with the Middle East and so on. He said, we need someone to run the 8th Army because Alexander can't do both. Auchinleck has already demonstrated that you can't do both. So who do we want to get? Well, we've got this very experienced commander named Gott, and he should be the guy to do it. Brooke didn't want Gott. He says to Churchill, listen, I got a guy home named Montgomery, I think would be really the right man for the job. Churchill says, no, it's got to be Gott. So they notify Gott, and they say, listen, come back here to Cairo, and we're going to put you in charge of 8th Army. So he climbs on a plane, and he starts flying back. Well, they're intercepted by Germans, and his plane is shot down. He's killed. And now Brooke says, Montgomery. Churchill says, okay, fine. So send for this guy, Montgomery, who is not physically a very impressive person. Now, I show this only because it demonstrates the importance of the ridge lines. You'll see that there's Alam, Halfa Ridge, and Risat Ridge. Notice that they run in an east-west fashion. And when Rommel tried to attack from the south, he has to turn north to try to cut off the British units that you see in front of him. And he's stopped by running into the ridge line that you see there. So he is forced back to retreat. Now I'm going to show this because I want to take us to the critical part that is going to unfold and will have a profound effect on what happens through the rest of the war, at least with the British involved, and in particular in the Western theater. First of all, who's this guy Montgomery? And why do we really care? All right. Montgomery had enormous experience being a commander at very different levels as he grew up through being an officer, a very junior officer, and then working his way up to the point where when the Germans attacked the French and British troops in France, he was there. And when he was able to be brought back to England, he was given charge of several important units that were guarding the southern and southeastern portion of England. So what? One of the things Montgomery had learned in his time, and he practiced diligently when he was in command in southeast England, was that he emphasized not just training, which he did extraordinarily well, and British senior officers began to deeply appreciate what he was doing. He also was able to integrate various arms of the military to cooperate with each other, particularly with the Air Force. This is a term that's thrown around called combined arms. But many times combined arms means integrating artillery and tanks and anti-tanks and infantry, to fight. But he added this particular dimension of the Air Force as well. He also radically changed the structure and defense of southeastern England. Now remember, after the English had evacuated from Dunkirk, they were bereft of many heavy weapons, and they expected the Germans to come across the channel. So when he was finally put in charge there, though the danger of a cross-channel invasion had been markedly reduced, he completely restructured how the defenses were to work. And that in itself meant a very different philosophy at work. So why is this important? He is flown from England to Cairo. He's given command of the 8th Army. What happens? The very first day he is in command, he basically goes to the senior commanders and he says, there will be no retreat. Any plans that Auchinleck, which would be natural, had put in place to possibly be beaten by Rommel and have to retreat to Cairo and even possibly across the Suez Canal, Montgomery comes and says, destroy those plans. Now think of the implication of that. You've been beaten by Rommel repeatedly, driven back thousands of miles, barely beat off another attack that had the danger of encircling your troops. And here's a guy who comes in, who's all of about 5'6", with a high-pitched voice, and says, no retreat. First day. What happens then? He says to Alexander, those guys sitting in Cairo that you had as a sort of reserve force, they're to be part of my army. You bring them closer to me. This is all within the first few days. He goes to where the command post had been for Auchinleck, which had been under a tent, close to the front lines, so he could have influence with what was going on. And Auchinleck had wanted constant reports brought to him so he could understand what was happening at the front line. Montgomery says, I'm moving my headquarters back next to where the Air Force has their headquarters. We're going to be right next to each other so we can communicate back and forth. In addition, we're done with the tent crap. My generals, my staff, are to have some elements of comfort, so they'll have the energy to do all the things I demand of them. And people say, well, you know, you're not sharing the difficulties with your troops. He says, they're not going to care as long as I lead them to victory. Again, a very different mindset. Then he says to them, we are going to practice and practice and practice. And we're going to do it according to the principles that I lay down, so that the force integration, the so-called idea of combined arms, will be as real to you at every moment of a combat as it needs to be successful. So the training is going to change from what you've been doing before, and you're going to do it according to my principles. This is all within the first week. Within a week, yes.
Where did you get your info on Montgomery?
There's a wonderful 3-volume history or biography of him written by a fellow named Hamilton. And a lot of it is in there in the details. And it's fascinating reading, because the first time I read the volumes, again, it's like being a tourist. You know, you go somewhere and you're kind of getting your bearings and you're seeing what's where. The next time you read it, you begin to sort out some of the details, and you begin to appreciate what it really means when you have someone come and take charge. I mean, this really is taking charge. But he did one other thing, which was really fascinating and threw off a lot of people, even especially among Americans.
Yeah.
And that was, he said, I don't want all these reports. Stop giving me patrol information. That's not what I'm here for. You can talk to my surrogate, de Guignon. I think I pronounced it right. Guignon. It's a French name, English, you know how that goes. Talk to him. He'll only wake me up between 9 o'clock at night and roughly 7 or so in the morning for a real emergency. If it's not an emergency, don't bother me. Now you think to yourself, what? Because he has to be fresh, he has to be clear thinking, he can't be inundated with detail. He feels that what he has to do is step back and look at the big picture and get that organized and not focus on the minutia. Too much detail overwhelms the mind, prevents you from acting. So when we go back to the Civil War and we talk about Grant sitting there smoking a cigar, he's not mired down in detail. He's thinking at the level at which he alone can think and act and set direction. He goes out and he meets basically everybody he can. He's not an imposing physical presence, if you will. His voice is not particularly impressive, as was Patton's not very impressive. But at the same time, his presence there communicates something vital to the Eighth Army, and that is that they can win. And under this guy, they can do it. That belief in the spirit of things is of enormous value. So Montgomery sets up a particular defense, waiting for Rommel to attack yet again. He knows, because of the events that are going on in the world. Now look at the time frame. This is August, September 42. This is when the Germans are advancing up towards Stalingrad. They're advancing down towards the Caucasus region. They look like they're on the march, but they're sucking up a lot of resources. And supplies getting across the Mediterranean to Rommel are under great attack. Even though they've tried to pound Malta into dust, they've not been successful, but they are inhibiting much supplies coming across to Rommel. He knows, that is, Montgomery knows, Rommel can't stay where he is. He either has to be victorious and drive us out of Egypt and clear the Mediterranean, or he's going to be in a world of hurt. So he prepares for Rommel's attack because he knows that has to come. Rommel can't stay where he is. In preparing his defense, he reorganizes the Eighth Army in a particular way, and he sets it up in a particular set of positions, which in detail do a lot to highlight the importance of terrain that I was talking about before. Get this particular territory strongly defended and stay in place. Wait for him to come to you. In the past, the British armies, when they confronted Rommel, used their armor aggressively. They tried to come forward and engage the German armor. What happened? They got wrecked for two reasons. One was the Germans were smart enough to place these 88s that you hear are so infamous as anti-tank weapons. They would set them up and draw the British armor onto them. And the 88s could take them out at 2,000 yards before they even got close enough to shoot. This is like, you know, Muhammad Ali fighting some guy 5'6". You know, he's just going to pound him at a distance. He's not going to get there. Montgomery says, no way that's going to happen. We don't have the weaponry yet to be able to take on German army head on. So what are we going to do? We're going to let them come to us, get them in with range where we can take them out. There is another spin to this, which is very important. If the Germans attack and they breach some of the lines, as they will in the south initially when they start their move, like you saw on the other slide, and a German tank has its tread blown off, all right? It's not destroyed, it's just no longer mobile. But now the Germans have to retreat. Do they abandon the tank, or do they have a way to recover it and get it back to their lines? Many times they're abandoned, which is an utter loss. And let's suppose that you are able to get it back. Now you've got to take it to a shop where it can be refurbished. What about all the supplies coming over those great distances? Do you have the stuff to repair? Whereas for the British, we take losses here. If we push the Germans back, we recover our vehicles and we have the resources a short distance away to fix everything. So even though when you read about the losses at battle, there's a great difference between what is wrecked on the battlefield but later recovered and brought back into use, or what is wrecked on the battlefield and lost forever. And those numbers play a constant role in what's going on. So Rommel does attack. And as you see here, he sweeps again through the south. The north is just too difficult. In addition, you've still got the British Navy up there. And they're not going to sit around if they see there's an attack coming in the north. They're going to use the heavy artillery that's present on those ships to go blast the daylights out of you. So the Germans are saying, you know, if we're south, they can't reach us, right? So that's one possibility. But as they come up and they confront the British forces, they're stopped yet again, and they're driven back. And when they're driven back, this is the last real offensive that Rommel's able to conduct. Things settle down for a period of time. Both sides are refitting, but it is obvious, absolutely obvious to both sides, that the buildup is strongly in favor of the British. And not only is it now a matter of just numbers, the British are getting better weapons. They're getting Sherman tanks, which still are not quite comparable to the best of the tanks that the Germans have in North Africa, the Mark IV with its gun and better armor. But they are certainly much better than the vast majority of Italian tanks and of many of the German. So they have that. What else? They're getting better anti-tank guns. So instead of a 2-pounder, they now get a 6-pounder. What does that mean? The increase in size, and they go on the weight of the shell, and that's kind of a dumb way to look at it from my perspective, but a 2mm is like 2-pounder is like a 40mm, and a 6-pounder is, I think, 57mm. And you think, well, that's not a huge difference. Oh, yes, it is. Given the distance over which it can penetrate and the type of ammunition that you're putting into it, that is a big advantage. What else? Stockpiling artillery and hundreds of thousands of rounds. What else? What you see on this has to do in part with minefields. Huge numbers of mines are put down by both sides. So you need mine clearing equipment. And this plays a huge role in what's going to unfold as Montgomery finally decides that it's time for him to take the initiative. Now, to put this in a brief perspective again, we're now talking about moving into October. Gee, it's almost October. How about that? We're going to finish up here in just a moment. What's going on elsewhere? In the United States and in England, an invasion force is being created. And it is going to move to North Africa. So within a very short period of time, Montgomery knows what's coming and what's going to be a distinct threat to the Axis control of North Africa. Now, even though the far western portion of North Africa is under Vichy control, particularly Morocco and Algeria, there's real question as to how the Vichy French will respond to a so-called Allied invasion. And that gets into a lot of political and other doctrinal issues that I'm not going to go into. But I want to end today by having you consider, in preparation perhaps for our next session, to think of the number of different fronts that are active at this point and how they influence what's going on elsewhere. So the Eastern Front, what's happening there? How does that influence what's happening in North Africa? With the invasion coming in North Africa in November of 42, how is that going to influence what Hitler is going to be able to do on the Eastern Front? How is he going to respond? There is a great separation historically, and I think reasonably, between the Pacific Theater and what I'll call the Western Theater. But they still are twined together to some degree. And later on in this series, we will explore some of those events in the Pacific area as well, because they do have an impact on what's going on. I will stick around for as long as you like. I appreciate it. Tom, if you want to leave it on for questions from Zoom land, that's fine. Whatever works for you folks. But again, I have to tell you, I just am so thankful you show up. You know, I appreciate it. I really do.
Congratulations, Gene, and
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been a long time coming. But I finally beat her down, and she
congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Michael, that grand picture was taken just before Cold Harbor. He might have been able to use a few more details.
There is no question that the amount of intelligence you have and the way you perceive what's going on has been very interesting. I know Joe.
Cold Harbor is a big deal
Yes, indeed.
because Lee loses him.
Yeah.
Has no idea where the hell Grant went. And that spells the end.
And there were some terrible things that happened at Cold Harbor other than the casualties. And that was the failure of both Lee and Grant to agree on how to get the wounded off the battlefield. And there's
That was
little that
everywhere.
one, yeah, there's very little one could say about that accrues to the benefit of either. It's pretty bad. Any questions from anyone out there in Zoom? Yes. Oh, boy, they're all satisfied or all asleep. Okay.
What about, at least when I had looked at this in the past, there was a lot made of fuel supply to run.
Yes.
And that he just simply ran out of fuel and couldn't do some of the stuff that he had in mind. Had you something to say about that? That wasn't, you didn't mention anything about his fuel, specifically about the fuel supply.
I did not. There were, there's been a lot made of that. But when
Yes.
you end up looking at the fuel consumption and what operations Rommel was able to take, the only time his fuel supplies were really down to almost fumes was after Alamein. In other words,
Okay.
once they had tried to resist Rommel's attacks, and they had to shift armor forces up and down to try to stifle where he was threatening to break through. Once the collapse occurred, they were really down to very little.
Okay.
And it was only the armor and a deliberate decision on the part of the senior generals, primarily the Germans, because the Italians weren't very happy with this, is that they couldn't get the infantry out very easily, and they had to run as fast as they could to get back to where they felt they could get supplies. And they had supply dumps at different places, so there were places to stop and fuel up, but they never had enough to be able to mechanize the infantry fully, and so a lot of them were captured. The interesting part of that too is that unlike what was going on the Eastern Front, where there were still a lot of horses being used, it's hard to imagine, but there were thousands of horses being used on the Eastern Front. Most of these units were relatively mechanized. That is, there were trucks, there were transport vehicles of one sort or another, because the distances were so huge. And the rail network so bereft of support that was the only way you could do anything. But the consumption was so heavy, particularly around this Battle of El Alamein, that the Germans just said, well, the Italians, good luck, hope you enjoy British mutton and stew, we're out of here. Yes.
The PBS thing, Winds of War, is showing a lot of sandstorms.
It's a great show.
Yes.
How can, I mean, sandstorms are coming up frequently with,
They certainly had to deal with them, and you'll see among certainly a number of troops where they have goggles and things that they're wearing. A lot of the time with sandstorms, it was a matter of just hunkering down. Nobody was going to do anything, because one of the problems you ran into was the sand getting in and blocking the filters of your vehicles. You may remember, prior to the launching of the attack in 1991, there was a lot of comment that the Abrams tanks were not going to work very well because they couldn't filter the sand. Turned out to be totally wrong. But the point was, back then, that was a real issue. So you had to cover your vehicle, you had to keep the sand out as best you could. You yourself would hunker down, and usually the sandstorms were not prolonged. Usually they were relatively brief. So you could uncover and get back to work, do things of that sort. One of the hard parts were all the flies. You try to eat, and you got flies all over the place.
the sand.
Yep, extra protein. I saw this fly doing a backstroke in my soup, you know. All right, well, thank you very much again. I look forward to seeing you all next week. And,
medical book at the end of the series, you'll get it.
oh,
I'm on page 80 now.
Next Monday, I think it is, there's a 1 hour session. If I recall correctly,
I think it's 2
Uh,
hours.
I think it's 2 hours.
is it 2 hours?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
It's 2 hours.
It's 2 hours.
Oh, I better lengthen my time.
Or speak very slow.
Well, you're going to have a better professor. Let me put it that way. You have a guy who really knows this stuff and it's going to be a fascinating time. The reason it's 2 hours is not because his lecture's 2 hours. His lecture's an hour.
Yeah, and then.
But there'll be plenty of time for discussion. And, you know, questions and stuff like that. And if some of you have been here for the World War I lectures and prior to World War I, maybe that'll help flesh out some of the information. And then I think there's another one 2 days later.
Yeah, November 1st. I think.
Yeah, November
That's-
1st.
Yeah.
So if you're really a glutton for punishment, you can be here Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday.
Yes, yes.